Alright, I consulted my notes. Apparently that was pretty much all of the stuff I had to tell you about basic animation, except specifically how to make a looping animation, which I'll go over shortly. But render settings are a thing that you also need to know, because there's like a few silly settings that you need to know with rendering multiple frames at once. So if you just go into your render settings like you usually would, these are pretty much the same for both Arnold and Redshift. I like rendering with Redshift because it's faster, especially when you're doing like 700 frames a week, haha. So first thing, I'm just going to go up to my top, decide what image format you want. I'm going to go PNG. I usually never use JPEG. PNG if I'm being lazy. TIFF or EXR if I want like nice images. TIFF just doesn't work with the one program I'm going to show you guys to compile these. So I'm going to go with PNGs. You can choose a file name prefix if you want. And this is just going to be, you know, what your files are labeled. So when they render out, you know, as all your image sequences, it's going to be like hey 1, hey 2, hey 3, etc. And then the important option is the frame and animation extension. You want to choose pretty much anything that doesn't say single frame at the bottom. Anything that's labeled with single frame isn't going to give you options for rendering multiple frames at once. My personal favorite is name_number.extension. I avoid stuff with extra periods in it because I feel like it usually messes up my computer, and I don't really know why you would want like the extension in the middle of the file name, so this is just the one that I go for because it's easy to look at and doesn't explode my computer. So you'll notice that once I choose that, since it's not labeled single frame, it's opened up some other options. Frame padding is basically just how many extra frames you want in your scene. I'm sorry, that made no sense. Frame padding is the number of additional zeros you want in your number. So if you set this to 4, it's going to render frame 1 is going to be 0001. Frame 100 is going to be 0, 100. I usually don't worry too much about this. It never seems to break any of the programs I use, no matter what I set this to, so a lot of times I'll just leave it at 4. Start frame and end frame are hopefully pretty self-explanatory. This is the frame you want to start rendering and the frame you want to stop rendering. So I'm going to go 1 to 120, and then the by frame is how many, it's like the distance between frames you want to render. So if you leave this at 1, it's going to render frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4. If you set by frame to frame 5, or to 5, it's going to render frame 1, frame 6, frame 11, frame 16. It's going to go by units of every 5th frame it's going to render. So that's really helpful to sort of test your animations, make sure, you know, that your lighting is pretty decent looking throughout before rendering every single frame, only to find that 80% of your animation has a weird shadow covering all of the main characters, that kind of thing. You can also set this to decimal numbers if you want. I've never had to do that. And then skip existing frames would be maybe your render got halfway through and then failed. You can do skip existing frames instead of changing these numbers, and anything where there's a file for it is just going to ignore it and go to the next frame. Only danger with this is if it's partially rendered a frame, so there's like one of those weird like files created, but it's not an actual image because my crashed halfway through rendering it. It's also going to skip that frame and not render it, so you'll have to go back and make sure that that frame exists in some kind of useful format for you. And then again, just go through with your renderable camera, make sure that this is set to whatever you want. You can decide if you want a alpha channel or a Z-depth channel. And then again, just your standard sizes for your images. I'm going to render these tiny because I don't want this to take forever. And then that's more or less that. I am going to throw in a quick... This is going to be like the ugliest animation that's ever existed. I'm just going to throw in a really quick sad ground plane and maybe change the colors of this really quick to... Don't use blends, but I'm just going to make this a blend because it's physically easy to click on and reach. And then I'm just going to throw in a sad sky dome light. If you have me for a class, please map an HDRI into this. I just want this as a demo object, so I don't really care. And you should also go into your view menu and your camera settings and just turn on your resolution gate. Make sure that everything you want in frame is in frame. for the time that you want it in frame. Nothing is worse than realizing half of your scene didn't render because your camera wasn't set up to render what you thought it was. Apart from that, to actually start your renders, you want to go out of the modeling menu into your rendering menu. And then there is an option for render. There's 2 ways to render multiple frames at once. And depending on which one you use, your images will be watermarked. So if you are using, and they might have changed this in more recent versions of Maya, I'm in 2018, if you are using Arnold, use render sequence. If you're using Redshift, I don't think it cares, but I usually use batch render because it's faster. But if you use batch render with Arnold, it is going to watermark your images, which is gross. And if you have me for class and you hand me watermarked stuff, I'm taking off points for it. So for Arnold, again, render sequence. It renders a little bit slower. If you want, you can open settings and like override stuff. But basically the difference between render sequence and batch render is that render sequence is going to open up this little render view and just sort of systematically go through and render all of your stuff. Whereas batch render, it doesn't open the render view. You'll just get a bunch of little updates down here, and it sort of like renders in the background and just saves out files as you go. Which makes it a little faster because it doesn't need to generate this preview of your images. But that's basically render settings for rendering multiple images at once. It should dump all of these, where have I put this? So if you have your scene set, it's going to dump all of your images in the images folder unless you tell it